In ancient Rome, freedom could vanish in a single afternoon, not in a courtroom with speeches and verdicts, but in a place that smelled of sweat, dust, and old fear, an auction yard where voices rose like waves and human lives were measured with the same cold attention given to livestock. Imagine the moment. A man who once walked with a name and a history is forced to stand still while strangers examine his teeth, his shoulders, the calluses on his hands. A woman tries not to tremble as a merchant lifts her chin to judge her age, her health, her usefulness. A child clings to a sleeve that may be pulled away forever, because in Rome, families could be divided as easily as coins were counted. We often picture Rome through marble temples, triumphal arches, and polished speeches about law and civilization, but the empire's brightness cast a long shadow, and that shadow had a face. The dark reality is that Rome did not merely include slavery, it depended on it, and the difference between belonging and being owned could be nothing more than bad luck, a lost battle, a debt unpaid, or the place where you were born. To understand what it was really like to be a slave, we have to step past the statues and into the machinery that made them possible, to see how a person became property, how identity was stripped down to a price, and how a vast system taught the enslaved to survive inside a world designed to control them. What did daily life look like when your body was not yours? How did fear shape the smallest routines? Sleep, work, silence, even hope. And when the Romans spoke about order and greatness, what did those words mean to the millions who carried water, turned millstones, harvested fields, scrubbed floors, dug in mines, and bled in arenas? This is not a story told to shock for its own sake. It is a journey into the hidden foundation of an empire, beginning with the instant freedom disappeared, so we can follow the chain, market to household, farm to mine, punishment to survival, hope to despair, and finally confront the moral cost of Rome's glory. In Rome, slavery was not a vague misfortune hovering at the edge of society. It was a precise mechanism, a legal and economic language that turned breathing people into movable goods. The road into that condition began in several doorways, and none of them required the victim to be wicked or foolish. War was the most common gate, entire villages swallowed after a campaign, survivors herded together, counted, sorted, and marched toward ports where the sea carried them to markets they could not imagine. Piracy and kidnapping fed the same hunger, especially along vulnerable coasts and borderlands, where a traveler could vanish as easily as a coin into a thief's palm. Debt, too, could be a trap, not always through formal enslavement in later periods, but through harsh forms of bondage and exploitation that blurred the line between obligation and ownership, especially when a creditor had power and the poor had none. And then there was birth, the most merciless doorway of all, because a child born to an enslaved mother inherited a fate before understanding what a fate was, as if the world itself had stamped the sentence onto the cradle. The market was where the transformation became visible. Even when sales happened privately, the logic was the same. The body was evaluated, the voice was ignored, and the past became irrelevant unless it raised the price. Buyers looked for strength, youth, skill, and obedience. And sellers learned to present human beings the way one presents tools: useful, durable, profitable. A person might be washed and oiled to look healthier, or forced to stand under good light so scars would not show. Some were made to wear placards listing origins, abilities, and defects, a blunt inventory that reduced a life to a handful of traits: knows accounts, speaks Greek, prone to running, has epilepsy. The humiliation was not only in the gaze of strangers, but in the way the gaze instructed the enslaved to see themselves, as if their worth were a sum of muscles and compliance. For many, the deepest wound was not the auctioneer's call, but the silence around their own name, because a name in Rome could be taken, replaced, mocked, or erased. Enslaved people were often renamed by their owners, sometimes with childish nicknames, sometimes with labels that marked origin, like Syrian or Thracian, sometimes with names meant to be amusing in a household where power could afford humor. Renaming was not a small insult. It was a ritual of possession, a way of declaring that identity was now granted by someone else and could be withdrawn at will. Roman law reinforced this transformation with chilling clarity. A slave was property, and property existed to be used. The enslaved had no independent legal personhood. They could not contract a marriage recognized by the state, could not own possessions in their own right, could not testify in many contexts without coercion, and could be punished at the discretion of the master, limited only by custom, reputation, or later regulations that were unevenly enforced. Even when a slave managed money or ran a business on behalf of the household, what they handled belonged to the owner, and the thin allowance sometimes granted to them, a peculium, a personal fund permitted but not guaranteed, could vanish with a change of mood or a change of master. This legal reality seeped into everyday life like dampness into stone. It shaped posture, speech, and the careful calculations of survival. The enslaved learned to read footsteps in corridors, to interpret a glance, to sense when a household was calm and when it was dangerous. Because the law was not a distant text, it was a presence that lived in every command and every threat. Family bonds were among the first casualties of this system. In the market, buyers did not purchase a mother's love or a father's promise. They purchased bodies, and bodies could be separated without explanation. Couples formed within slavery often lived under the constant shadow of sale, and children could be taken away in a moment that felt like a sudden tearing of the world. Owners sometimes encouraged unions for pragmatic reasons. More children meant more property, yet those unions remained fragile, dependent on a master's convenience rather than the dignity of commitment. In some households, enslaved people wore collars inscribed with messages demanding their return if they fled. A small ring of metal that proclaimed to everyone who saw it that escape was anticipated and mercy was not. Branding existed in certain contexts as well. Not always universal, but present enough to be feared. Another sign that Rome understood the enslaved as a category to be marked, tracked, and controlled. And yet, within this crushing reduction, a paradox persisted. Rome valued the skills of the people it owned. An educated Greek might become a tutor. A physician might be forced to heal those who claimed mastery over him. A skilled artisan might build luxury for the elite while sleeping with the anxiety of a disposable tool. This is where the cruelty became more refined, because intelligence did not protect the enslaved. It merely made them more profitable. The system could exploit not only the body but the mind, harvesting talent while refusing dignity, turning knowledge into another chain. The result was a society where status was constantly performed and constantly policed, where the master's comfort depended on the slave's invisibility, and where the enslaved learned to survive by becoming fluent in the rules that denied their humanity. In that world, the loss of freedom was not an abstract tragedy. It was a daily condition, reinforced by law, market, and custom, until a person could be surrounded by thousands and still feel utterly alone, owned, watched, and measured, living inside an identity that Rome had rewritten from the outside. The day of a Roman slave did not begin with sunrise so much as with necessity, because the household, the farm, the workshop, and the city itself moved on a rhythm powered by people who could not refuse. In a wealthy urban home, the first sounds might be footsteps in the dark as servants rose before their owners, lighting lamps, warming water, sweeping courtyards, and preparing the quiet stage on which Roman comfort would appear effortless. Some slaves worked close to the center of domestic life: cooks, cleaners, porters, nurses, tutors, learning to move like shadows, to anticipate needs before they became commands, to keep their faces neutral even when their bodies were exhausted. The intimacy of that work did not make it gentle, it made it unpredictable. A spilled cup, a misunderstood order, a moment of perceived disrespect could turn the air sharp, because in a world where authority was absolute, small mistakes were treated as threats. Yet the same proximity could sometimes create narrow spaces of security. A trusted steward might manage accounts. A skilled attendant might be valued enough to avoid the harshest treatment, not because the system was kind, but because profit and convenience occasionally mimicked mercy. Beyond the city walls, on the broad shoulders of the countryside, slavery became more openly brutal. On latifundia, large estates that fed Rome's appetite, field slaves labored under overseers who measured time in quotas and punishment. They rose with the first light and worked until it thinned, cutting grain, pruning vines, hauling loads that bent the spine into a permanent curve. Their hands were tools, their backs were engines, and their hunger was managed like a calculation. Enough food to keep them working, rarely enough to let them feel whole. Crowded sleeping quarters, rough clothing, and the constant presence of surveillance shaped the atmosphere, not only physically, but psychologically, because the enslaved were expected to be productive and, above all, controllable. Chains were not always worn, but the possibility of restraint lived in the background, especially for those considered likely to run. The countryside offered fewer witnesses, and fewer witnesses often meant fewer limits. There were lives even darker, lives that Rome itself seemed to push underground. In mines and quarries, slaves worked in conditions that ancient writers and later historians alike describe as close to a death sentence. Air thick with dust, darkness broken by weak light, bodies driven to extract the raw materials that built the empire's monuments and fed its economy. This was labor designed to consume human beings. In such places, the future narrowed to a single brutal horizon. Endure today, if possible, and hope the body does not fail before the work is done. Punishment did not always require a formal crime. It could be a method of management, a way of keeping despair from turning into defiance. Rome understood fear as a tool, and it used that tool with practiced efficiency, from beatings to confinement, from humiliation to public displays meant to instruct others without words. The arena, too, belonged to this landscape of forced labor, though it wore spectacle like perfume over decay. Not every gladiator was a slave, but many were, and the logic of the system remained the same. The body was a commodity whose value rose when it entertained. Training could be disciplined and even carefully managed, because a fighter who died too quickly was a poor investment. Yet the goal was always to place human vulnerability under the eyes of a crowd hungry for sensation. The violence of that world was not only in the blade, it was in the transformation of suffering into public pleasure, in the way applause could erase the fact that a man bleeding in sand might have once been a farmer, a son, a storyteller, someone whose life had been stolen and repurposed into entertainment. Across all these settings, home, field, mine, arena, the system relied on punishment, but it also relied on routine, because routine turns horror into habit. A slave's survival often depended on learning the invisible map of power, which overseer was quick to anger, which mistress punished jealousy, which master valued silence over speed, which tasks were dangerous and which merely exhausting. Even language could be a shield. A slave who spoke well might be assigned to errands rather than backbreaking labor, while one who remained mute could be seen as stubborn, or worse, as disposable. Many were forced to carry their obedience like a mask, not because they believed in their bondage, but because resistance had consequences that could spread beyond the individual to anyone connected to them. The threat of collective punishment, the ease with which families and friendships could be broken, made courage a complicated thing. Sometimes the boldest act was not a dramatic rebellion, but a quiet choice to endure while protecting someone else. And still, within this machinery, traces of humanity persisted, stubborn as grass between stones. Slaves formed bonds in kitchens and courtyards, in the margins of fields, in whispered conversations held in the thin hours before sleep. They traded small favors, shared scraps of food, carried each other through illness, and built fragile communities that existed inside the very structure designed to isolate them. Some found meaning in religion, whether in household cults imposed by owners or in personal devotions carried from homelands. Faith could become a secret room in the mind, a place no master could fully enter. Others practiced small resistances, working slowly when no one watched, hiding a tool, feigning ignorance, preserving a memory of who they had been before Rome renamed them. Daily life in chains was not a single experience but a spectrum of suffering shaped by task and place, yet what united it was the constant awareness that one's body and time belonged to another. In that awareness, every ordinary action, lifting water, grinding grain, sweeping ash, mending cloth, became part of a larger struggle, not only to stay alive, but to remain, in some inner sense, a person rather than a thing. Hope existed in Roman slavery, but it rarely arrived as pure light. More often it came filtered through conditions, written in the fine print of someone else's power. The empire liked to tell itself that slavery was not always a life sentence, and in many cases that was technically true. A master could free a slave, and Rome had names and rituals for the act, as if ceremony could soften the fact that freedom was still granted like a favor. Some were manumitted after years of service, some because they had saved money from a permitted allowance, some because they had made themselves indispensable, and some simply because an owner wanted to display generosity in public. Yet even this door, when it opened, did not lead into full belonging. The freed person, now a libertus or liberta, stepped into a world where the past clung like a shadow. New legal status, yes, but also new obligations, expectations of loyalty to the former master, and a social stigma that polite society seldom forgot. Freedom could come with a chain of gratitude, and gratitude could become another form of control, less visible than iron, but still heavy in the mind. The promise of manumission shaped behavior in subtle ways. It encouraged obedience not only through fear but through desire, turning the future into a bargaining chip. A slave might endure humiliations in silence because the thought of release, however distant, made endurance feel strategic rather than hopeless. In households where freedom was dangled like a reward, rivalry could grow among the enslaved because scarcity does not only starve the body, it divides communities. The possibility of liberation could create a hierarchy within bondage. Those trusted with accounts, errands, or education might imagine a path upward, while those in fields and mines saw only years collapsing into exhaustion. Even when manumission was real, it remained uneven, dependent on the owner's mood, finances, heirs, and fears. A master could promise freedom and die before fulfilling it, and an heir could treat that promise as dust. The law might recognize certain procedures for manumission, but laws move slowly in a society where social power moves faster. Freedmen and freedwomen occupied an uneasy middle ground that Rome both used and distrusted. They could work, marry, and accumulate wealth, sometimes rising into remarkable success, especially in trade and administration, yet their social ascent was marked with limits that reminded them, and everyone else, where they had come from. Many took on the former master's name, which offered protection and connection, but also stamped their identity with a permanent reminder of dependence. For some, the transition brought genuine relief. The simple ability to sleep without immediate fear of arbitrary punishment, to plan for tomorrow as one's own. For others, it brought a new kind of anxiety. The pressure to perform gratitude, the fear of losing fragile status, the knowledge that their children might be freer than they were, but that the stain of origin could still linger in whispers. In a world obsessed with rank, freedom was not a single step. It was a long climb, and the ground beneath remained unstable. If manumission was the empire's preferred story of hope, rebellion was its nightmare. Rome's vast dependence on enslaved labor created a tension it could never fully dissolve, because the same system that produced wealth also produced fear. Masters lived with the awareness, sometimes spoken, often unspoken, that their comfort depended on the compliance of those who outnumbered them in certain spaces, especially on rural estates. That fear shaped architecture and habit. Locks, controlled movements, strict supervision, and punishments designed not only to correct, but to terrify. When rebellions did erupt, they exposed the fragile seam under Rome's confidence. The Great Slave Wars, and most famously the uprising associated with Spartacus, were not merely episodes of violence. They were moments when the empire saw its own reflection and did not like what it revealed. Rome responded with overwhelming force and with messages written in bodies, public executions, mass crucifixions, and displays meant to instruct the living through the suffering of the dead. The cruelty was not accidental. It was policy, a language of terror intended to make the idea of revolt feel more painful than bondage itself. Yet rebellion did not always take the form of armies. Most enslaved people could not afford open defiance, and many had too much to lose in the smallest sense. A child nearby, a fragile friendship, a body already weakened by labor. Resistance often lived in quieter forms, running away, sabotaging tools, stealing food, delaying work, spreading rumors, holding on to forbidden relationships. These acts could seem small against the scale of empire, but they mattered because they reminded the enslaved, and sometimes even the masters, that control was never complete. Every runaway notice, every collar inscribed with threats, every household rule about movement was an admission that slavery required constant enforcement. The system did not run on chains alone. It ran on vigilance, on the daily reinforcement of who could command and who must obey. between the promise of manumission and the terror of punishment. A slave's inner world became a battlefield. Hope could keep a person alive, but it could also wound them, because hope that depends on another's will can collapse without warning. Fear could prevent reckless acts, but it could also hollow out the spirit, teaching the body to flinch before the blow arrives. This is the paradox at the heart of Roman slavery. The empire offered a thin possibility of freedom not as justice, but as management, a way to make obedience seem rational while keeping the hierarchy intact. And beneath it all, the master's fear mirrored the slave's suffering, binding both sides to a system that demanded constant tension to survive, until even the idea of peace felt fragile, temporary, and purchased at someone else's expense. Rome called itself eternal, and from a distance it could look that way. Roads stretching like veins across continents, aqueducts lifting water into the sky, temples and forums declaring order in stone. But the empire's permanence was an illusion built on exhausting motion, and much of that motion came from bodies that did not belong to themselves. Slavery was not a side room in the Roman house. It was the framework behind the walls. The wealth that filled aristocratic dining rooms, the endless flow of grain that kept the city from starving, the comfort of baths and gardens and leisure, even the grand projects that still dazzle the modern eye, all rested on labor that was coerced, cheap, and replaceable. Rome's economy depended on captive workforces in agriculture, in mining, in construction, in domestic service, in shipping and workshops. And because the empire expanded through conquest, conquest replenished the supply, turning war into a pipeline that fed both profit and prestige. The triumphal procession that celebrated victory was also, in quieter terms, an announcement that new lives had been captured and would be absorbed into the machine. In the city, slavery made refinement possible. A senator could appear calm and philosophical because someone else was heating his water, cleaning his clothes, preparing his meals, carrying messages, tutoring his children, running errands through crowded streets. Even the cultural achievements Rome admired, literature copied by hand, performances staged, household staffed to support patronage, were sustained by people whose own lives were treated as instruments. In the countryside, the story grew harsher and more direct. Large estates produced the wine and oil and grain that fed markets and armies, and enslaved labor allowed landowners to chase profits with a ruthlessness that free peasants could rarely match. When harvests failed or taxes rose, the burden fell first on those with no legal voice. The enslaved were the empire's shock absorbers. They absorbed hunger, disease, punishment, and loss so that the elite could preserve stability and appearance. And yet, Rome's dependence on slavery did more than create wealth. It shaped the Roman imagination of what a person was worth. When a society grows used to owning human beings, it begins to measure humanity in usefulness, to treat compassion as weakness, to confuse power with order. The slave became a mirror in which the free Roman could admire his own status, a living boundary line that defined who mattered and who did not. This mindset seeped into language, law, and everyday behavior, teaching even ordinary citizens to accept cruelty as normal. It also created a permanent moral contradiction. Rome praised virtue, discipline, and justice, while maintaining a system that required injustice to function. Philosophers could debate ethics under shaded porticos while the people who swept those porticos remained unseen. Magistrates could speak of law while the enslaved existed outside its protections. The empire's greatness demanded blindness, and the blindness was not only individual, it was cultural, reinforced through habit, until questioning the system felt like questioning Rome itself. The human cost of this arrangement was not limited to the enslaved, though they carried the heaviest weight. Slavery distorted relationships across society, training masters to trust domination, training the enslaved to hide their true thoughts, and turning households into small theaters of power where intimacy and fear lived side by side. A child raised in a home full of servants could grow up believing that command was natural and obedience was destiny, not because the child was born cruel, but because cruelty had been organized into daily life. Even among the enslaved, the system sowed divisions between those in the house and those in the field, between the skilled and the unskilled, between those close enough to taste freedom and those who never would. Rome's machine did not merely consume bodies, It managed emotions, it engineered incentives, it used hope and terror as tools to keep the gears turning. When we look back at Rome, the temptation is to be impressed first by the visible remains, the stones that survived, the Latin inscriptions that still speak, the engineering that seems to defy time. But the truer foundation of the empire was not marble. It was the quiet, relentless labor of people who rarely left a name behind. Every polished surface had a hidden underside. Every banquet implied someone else's hunger. Every statue implied hands that carved while their own futures were not their own. To see this is not to erase Rome's achievements, but to understand what they were made of and what they demanded from those trapped beneath them. The darkest reality is that an empire can look magnificent while its greatness is paid for in fear, separation, and exhaustion, and that the distance between civilization and cruelty can be smaller than we like to imagine. When Rome called itself eternal, it was speaking through monuments. When the enslaved endured day after day, they were speaking through survival, revealing an older truth that outlasts empires. Power can build wonders, but it always leaves a moral footprint, and history remembers not only what was constructed, but what it cost to construct it.